Welcome to Wild West Love Chronicles. Today, I'm going to share a deeply touching and gripping story. Let's listen closely and feel every moment together. The wind howled across the open plains, pulling at the cracked wooden fence posts that lined the edge of Dust Creek Ranch like forgotten sentries. Dry grass rustled in anxious whispers, bending low under the weight of the Wyoming sun, while clouds of dust danced along the horizon like ghosts refusing to settle. The land stretched in every direction, vast and silent and untouched, except for the single figure on horseback riding the fence line at a steady, mechanical pace. Elijah Turner sat slouched in his saddle, hat pulled low against the glare, boots crusted with dust, and eyes hidden behind a face weathered by years of sun and solitude. The creak of his saddle and the dull clop of his horse's hooves were the only sounds that followed him, a slow rhythm that echoed the tired beat of a heart that had long since given up trying to feel. He didn't ride for company. He didn't ride for beauty. He rode because if he didn't move, something inside him would rot and collapse. Dust Creek Ranch had once been full of life. That was before the fire. Before his boy's laugh vanished into the wind and his wife's lullaby stopped floating through the open windows. Before sickness took them both, one after the other, like a cruel joke, drawn out over 2 seasons of rainless days. Now the house sat like a monument of mourning, a hollow structure with rooms that echoed too loudly and beds too neatly made. Elijah hadn't stepped foot in the town of Auburn Ridge for nearly 7 months. The last time, he'd gone to bury his wife. Before that, he'd gone to bury their son. After the funerals, the visits had stopped. The ranch became a wall he built around himself, and the people in town seemed happy to forget he existed. Rumors grew in the absence of truth. Some said he'd gone mad. Others claimed he wandered the land at night talking to ghosts. A few said he was already dead, just too stubborn to lie down. But the pantry shelves were low. Salt was gone, flour nearly spent, and the last of the coffee had been stretched thinner than it had any right to be. Elijah hated going into town, hated the way people looked at him, half pity, half fear, but necessity overruled pride. He saddled his mare, packed a worn canvas bag, and left the ranch behind, with the same silence he wore like a second skin. The road into Auburn Ridge was familiar but unchanged. Nothing moved fast in this part of the country, and that included time. The clapboard storefronts stood with their paint curling off in slow surrender. The saloon still leaned to one side like it had something to say but didn't dare speak. And the church bell, rusted and barely used, loomed above it all, watching. Elijah passed through without a word, hat tipped low, eyes forward. The townspeople parted like dust in front of him, saying nothing, but staring long after he passed. He dismounted in front of Hawkins' General Store and tied the mare to a post. Inside, he gathered what he needed without small talk, piling sacks of meal and tins of beans into his bag. He paid with exact change, nodded once, and was ready to leave when he heard the commotion outside. A crowd had gathered near the edge of town, just past the livery, forming a loose ring around a raised platform made of crates and planks. Elijah didn't stop, not at first. His instincts told him trouble was thick in the air, and he had no appetite for trouble. But a sharp voice, barking commands in a thick accent, and the faint sound of weeping drew his eyes over his shoulder. An auction, not for horses, not for cattle, for people. He hesitated. There were 5 of them, 4 young women and a child, standing barefoot in the dust, with sunburned cheeks and downcast eyes. Most were thin, too thin, clothed in ragged dresses that once might have been colorful. 2 of the women were white, likely orphans or drifters. One girl looked Mexican, her arms crossed in defiance. The child, maybe 8 or 9, was trembling and clutching a stranger's hand. But the 5th girl, she was different. She stood a little apart, shoulders straight, back rigid, her hands clenched at her sides like fists of protest. Her hair, black as coal and pinned in a messy braid, was threaded with dust, but her eyes, almond-shaped and burning with something between shame and fury, never left the man barking orders beside her. Elijah's boots seemed to move before his thoughts did. "She's not local," someone in the crowd muttered. "No English," another said. "Elijah Turner." a third voice whispered, drawing nervous glances. He ignored them all. The man running the auction was a heavy-set trader with a patchy beard and crooked teeth. His coat was too small and stained with something brown and old. He waved a sheaf of papers in the air. Legal and proper. These girls are indentured, same as livestock. Workin' contracts for good, God-fearing folk. No shame in taking help if you can pay. No one stepped forward. The girl with the black braid was last. The trader's voice faltered. Come on now, folks. Fine hands, knows needlework, ain't even cost much. Just $5, and she's yours. No one moved. She's Chinese, someone whispered. She'll bring bad luck. Elijah looked at her again. Her eyes met his. Not a plea, not fear, just a daring kind of defiance, like she'd rather be burned than bought. Something about that gaze gripped the bottom of his chest, like a memory he didn't want to feel. His hand found his coat pocket and closed around the rough edge of a crumpled bill. The trader was turning away in frustration. Guess I'll leave her for the coyotes. 5. The word wasn't loud, but it sliced through the crowd like a knife. Heads turned. The trader blinked. What? I'll pay $5, Elijah repeated. His voice was calm, final. No one else said a word. He stepped forward, pulled the bill from his pocket, and handed it to the trader without looking at him. The man took it greedily, waving the girl off the platform. She's yours. The girl didn't move. Elijah turned to her. Her eyes were still locked on him, but her fists had relaxed. He gave a slight nod, then turned away, expecting her to follow. She did. They walked through the stunned silence of the crowd, a slow procession of dust and disbelief. Elijah didn't speak. He didn't know what to say. He just kept walking, feeling her steps behind him, steady and quiet. At the mare he stopped, untied the reins, then motioned to the saddle. She paused. He waited. Finally, without a word, she climbed up behind him. As the horse began the long journey back to Dust Creek Ranch, the town of Auburn Ridge faded behind them, swallowed by heat waves and silence. The wind picked up again, carrying whispers through the grass, as if the land itself was watching something strange and holy take shape. Elijah Turner, the ghost of Dust Creek, had bought a girl for $5. But as they rode into the horizon, two shadows on horseback drawn against the dying sun, it was not the price paid that mattered. It was the life beginning. The sun was slipping lower in the sky by the time Dust Creek Ranch came into view, its silhouette framed against an orange blaze that soaked the horizon. Elijah didn't look back. He never did. Behind him, the girl rode without speaking, her small hands clenched around the saddle horn, her posture rigid and quiet. The horse moved steadily, unhurried, as if sensing the weight of the moment on both their backs. The only sound was the wind whistling through dry sage and the slow creak of worn leather. They reached the main house as dusk took hold, and the light dipped enough to pull shadows long across the yard. Elijah dismounted first and turned to offer her a hand. She stared at it, hesitated, then slowly let herself down. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. The ranch house loomed like a relic of another life, its porch sagging at one end, and the shutters on the second-floor window hanging crooked. Elijah pushed the door open and stepped aside. She hesitated again, uncertain, not afraid, and walked past him into the dim hallway. He followed her inside, lit a kerosene lamp, and set it on the kitchen table. The flickering glow spilled into the room, warming the cracked walls and weathered floorboards. Dust swirled in the air like memory. He pointed toward the far side of the room. There's a cot by the stove, he said. You can sleep there tonight. It's warm. Tomorrow I'll clean out the bunkhouse. She didn't reply. He looked at her, then nodded and turned to the cabinet. He found a clean tin plate and filled it with the last of the cornbread, a small piece of salted pork, and half a boiled potato. She didn't move as he set the plate in front of her, nor when he slid over a canteen of water. She just stood, staring at the food like it was a puzzle too complicated to solve. Finally, with a quiet motion, she sat. Her movements were deliberate, graceful, even in their caution. She picked up the bread first, tore off a small piece, and ate without looking up. Elijah didn't watch her. He busied himself tending the stove, feeding it pine scraps to push the chill out of the floorboards. When the plate was clean and the canteen empty, she set them aside and rose. She didn't ask where to go. She didn't speak at all. She walked over to the cot, sat down, and slowly stretched out, facing the wall. Her shoes stayed on. Elijah said nothing. He turned down the flame on the lamp, moved to the far corner, and rolled out his old blanket. The floor was hard, but it was habit now. He didn't want to sleep in his own bed. For a while, there was silence. Then, in a voice soft enough to disappear under breath, she said, "Mei Lin." He didn't move. She said it again, more firmly this time, "Mei Lin." "My name." Elijah stared at the ceiling for a moment. "Elijah," he replied. She didn't answer. Outside, the coyotes called to each other in the distance, their cries weaving between the hills like the last threads of a dream that refused to die. The days after passed in a rhythm that slowly settled, like silt in a still river. Elijah woke before dawn, as he always did, and didn't disturb her. By the time the sun crested the ridge, he'd already been out to check the fences, water the livestock, and haul 2 buckets from the well. He came back expecting her to still be asleep. She wasn't. She stood near the stove, feeding the fire with what kindling remained. The cot was folded neatly. The plate and canteen from the night before had been scrubbed and left drying on a towel. She said nothing. Neither did he. By midday, she had followed him out without a word. He didn't give her orders. She didn't ask permission. She gathered eggs, swept out the barn, mended a split in the chicken wire fence with a piece of old twine. At first, Elijah watched from a distance, unsure what to make of it. But she moved with purpose. Her hands were quick, her eyes sharper than he'd seen even in some ranch hands. When he took a break near the porch with a dipper of well water, she stood 5 feet from him and offered a handful of wild mint leaves. He didn't ask where she found them. She didn't explain. He just nodded and set them in a tin to dry near the stove. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with weight, like 2 heavy stones sitting beside each other in the same stream, each unmoving but shaped by the same current. One night, 2 weeks after she arrived, Elijah walked in from the barn later than usual, arms sore from chopping winter firewood. He paused at the door, blinking. The kitchen table was set. 2 plates, a pot of soup with sliced potato and wild herbs. A biscuit folded in half and pressed flat, like she'd tried to remember how she'd seen one made. She sat across from him, waiting. He didn't speak, just took his seat, lifted his spoon, and began to eat. The soup was thin. It was the best thing he'd tasted in months. Over time, something shifted. She hummed when she worked, soft tunes he didn't recognize, lilting and slow, like lullabies that had crossed oceans. Elijah found himself waiting for those sounds without meaning to. He noticed how she tied her braid tighter on days when the wind came strong from the east. How she wore his wife's old gloves when handling firewood. Though they hung loose on her hands, she began riding with him along the fence lines. The first time, she was stiff in the saddle, fingers curled too tight. By the 3rd ride, she moved with the sway of the mare, head up, eyes searching the horizon. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. But silence wasn't protection from the past. One evening, as the sun slid low and the fields burned golden, Elijah sat on the porch, sharpening his knife. Mei Lin sat beside him with a tin of beans between her palms. Without warning, he asked, "Why didn't you run?" She didn't look at him. He waited. After a while, she said, "Nowhere to run." He nodded. She added, "I've run enough." They said nothing else that night. Rumors reached the town before Elijah ever returned. People talked, said the China woman was working the ranch like a wife. Said Elijah had gone and bought himself a servant. Others whispered worse. In saloons and behind counters, men speculated on what she was doing in that old house, how long before something went wrong. But none of them said it to his face. When Elijah finally rode into town again, he went straight to Hawkins' store. He bought flour, salt, and 2 bolts of plain cloth. No one dared ask what the cloth was for. Hawkins handed him a folded slip of paper with a name scribbled in ink. "You best know, trader's back. Calls himself Jed Sawyer. Asking about that girl." Elijah didn't blink. He nodded once and tucked the paper into his coat. That night, Elijah didn't sleep. He sat near the stove, eyes open in the dark, the firelight throwing long shadows across the floor. Mei Lin appeared in the doorway, holding a tin cup of water. She offered it to him without a word. He took it. He looked at her. "If someone comes asking, you don't open the door. You stay out of sight." Her gaze didn't waver. "I'm not afraid." "I am," he said. It was the first time he'd admitted it. She sat down beside him. They said nothing more until the fire burned low and the stars blinked quietly above their heads. The next morning, she was gone before he rose. Panic clawed at his chest as he flung open the door. But then he saw her, near the fence, harvesting dry herbs from the wind-blown edge of the pasture. Calm, steady, she came back with 2 handfuls and laid them out in neat rows on a scrap of muslin. When Elijah spoke that night, his voice cracked, like bark peeling from a tree. "You don't owe me anything." She blinked. "I know. Not even your name." She looked at him, the flicker of the lamp caught in her eyes. "You gave me back mine." The ranch felt different after that. Warmer, even as winter crept close. Elijah found the air didn't ache quite so hard in his lungs. The cold didn't bite as deep in his bones. Some nights, he even laughed, low and brief, but real. He built her a small sewing table from scrap wood. She made curtains from the cloth he'd brought, simple and clean. She placed dried orange peels in jars, and every morning the kitchen smelled faintly of citrus and pine. He taught her how to shoot. She showed him how to brew tea with roots he didn't recognize. They built something. Not fast, not loud, but real. And then the rider came. Not a letter, not a telegram. Just a man on horseback, coat black as coal, watching the ranch from the ridge, then turning back toward town. Elijah stood at the gate, watching until the figure vanished. When he turned, Mei Lin was already behind him. Neither of them said a word, but both of them knew. Storms were coming. The snow came early that year, blanketing the hills before the trees had finished shedding their leaves. Dust Creek Ranch transformed overnight, the golden tones of autumn swallowed in a white silence, so pure it felt like memory itself had been hushed. The cold bit sharper than usual, and the wind carried with it something more than frost, something that prickled beneath the skin, like the edge of a blade not yet drawn. Elijah stood in the barn doorway, arms crossed, breath ghosting from his mouth as he watched Mei Lin bundle straw around the chicken coop. She moved quickly, decisively, her face partially covered with one of the hand-stitched scarves she'd made from leftover fabric. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, but her eyes held no hesitation. She belonged to the land now, or perhaps it belonged to her. Either way, she worked it with the kind of grace no one could teach. He didn't say anything as she passed him, just tipped his head slightly. She returned the gesture without a word. Inside the barn, the horses snorted quietly. He checked the tack, ran his fingers along the worn leather straps, and tried not to think about the rider on the ridge. 3 days had passed since then, and no more signs had come. No letters, no visitors, no smoke on the horizon, but something was shifting. He felt it in the marrow of his bones. That night, as the wind clawed at the shutters and the fire popped with pine knots, he sat across the table from Mei Lin in silence. She was threading a needle, patching one of his worn shirts with thread so fine it looked like spider silk. He watched the flick of her fingers, the tilt of her head, the way the light caught the slope of her cheek. There was something unspoken between them, something neither of them dared touch. He cleared his throat. "They'll come soon." She didn't look up. "The man on the ridge." "Yes." She tied off the thread, bit the end, then placed the shirt neatly on the table. "He's not alone." Elijah nodded. "Likely not." She leaned back in her chair, hands folded in her lap. You kept my name safe. I'll keep yours." He looked at her. Really looked. And something behind his ribs ached in a way he hadn't felt in years. "You don't need to. I want to." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the snow fell harder, whispering secrets to the earth. The next morning, Elijah saddled up before dawn. Mei Lin stood by the gate with a sack of supplies and a folded scrap of parchment. She didn't ask where he was going. She didn't need to. "Won't be long," he said. "Take the long gun," she replied, and handed it to him. He did. The ride into Auburn Ridge was quiet. The snow muffled the world, even the horses' hooves barely making a sound as they moved through drifts and over frozen creek beds. Elijah kept his hat low, his coat drawn tight, and his mind sharper than it had been in years. The town looked the same, worn and tired, but there was tension under the surface. Eyes watched from windows. A door closed quietly as he passed. No greetings, no smiles. He tied the mare outside Hawkins' store and walked in, boots heavy with slush. The storekeeper glanced up from his ledger and paled slightly. "Turner," Hawkins said, "didn't expect you in again so soon." "Where is he?" Elijah asked. Hawkins hesitated, then nodded toward the saloon. "He's been asking about you. And her. Got a marshal's badge, but don't look official." Elijah turned without another word and stepped back into the snow. The saloon door creaked as he entered. The smell of sour whiskey, stale smoke, and damp wool pressed in on him. A handful of men sat at tables, murmuring over cards and drinks. In the far corner, by the fire, sat the man he remembered, Jed Sawyer. His coat was newer, trimmed in fur. His boots shined. But his eyes were the same, mean, calculating, and cold. He looked up as Elijah approached, and a slow grin crept across his face. "Well," Sawyer drawled, "the ghost himself." Elijah didn't sit. Sawyer gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Don't want a drink? Come on, it's snowing out there. Sit, let's talk." Elijah's voice was quiet but firm. "You don't belong here." Sawyer raised an eyebrow. "Seems I've got business. Legal business. A missing indenture. Foreign national. Stolen property." Elijah's jaw tightened. "She's not property. She is by paper. Got it right here." He tapped a folder on the table, then leaned back. "You think $5 buys you anything more than trouble, Turner?" "You come near that ranch," Elijah said, "you won't leave upright." The saloon went silent. Even the piano player stopped. Sawyer's grin faded. "I got men coming in by train tomorrow," he said after a pause. "A marshal who ain't local, a real one. We'll see how long you hold up then." Elijah didn't flinch. He turned and walked out, leaving wet footprints that stretched like black scars across the floor. He didn't ride home. Not immediately. He took a detour through the cemetery just outside town, past the crooked fence and the leaning gravestones. He found the markers for his wife and son beneath a patch of frozen earth dusted in snow. He stood there a long while. When he finally returned to the ranch, Mei Lin was already on the porch, arms folded, her scarf fluttering in the wind. "How many?" she asked. "Too many." She nodded once and opened the door. They spent that night preparing in silence. The morning came sharp and bright. The snow had stopped, but the sky was brittle with cold. Elijah loaded the rifles. Mei Lin packed jars of preserved fruit and strips of dried meat into a bag. They didn't talk about what would happen. They didn't need to. By noon, the riders came. 6 of them, Sawyer among them, and a man wearing a marshal's badge that glittered too clean for a place like Auburn Ridge. Elijah stood at the gate, long gun in his arms. Mei Lin stood behind the porch rail, a pistol strapped at her hip. The lead rider raised his hand. "Marshal Boyd, I'm here to retrieve federal property." "No federal law covers people," Elijah replied. Sawyer rode forward. "She's mine, Turner. Bought legal in California. Her contract's binding." "I paid you $5, Elijah said. Sawyer grinned. That paid for silence, not freedom. From behind the porch post, Mei Lin stepped forward. Her voice rang out clear, louder than it ever had. "My name is Mei Lin. I am not property. I am not for sale. I was taken, not bought. Kidnapped, dragged across ocean and desert." The men on horseback shifted uncomfortably. One looked down at his reins. Another spat into the snow and didn't meet her eyes. Sawyer laughed, but it was hollow. "Pretty speech. Won't mean much when law's on my side." Then came the sound of hooves behind them. Dozens. The townsfolk of Auburn Ridge. They came slowly, one by one, gathering like storm clouds. Some rode horses. Others came on foot. Judge Hollister was among them, bundled in his old court coat, silver hair whipping in the wind. "You bring papers, boy?" the judge asked Sawyer. "I do." "Let me see 'em." Sawyer dismounted, fuming, and handed over the folder. The judge flipped through it with trembling fingers. After a few moments, he held the papers over the lantern flame one of the townsfolk carried. The fire took quickly. "You've no claim," Hollister said. "Hell, I don't," Sawyer barked. "You can't. You want to try enforcing it, do it elsewhere. Not in this town. Not against this man. Not against her." Sawyer looked around, realizing none of the other riders would back him now. "You'll regret this," he hissed at Elijah. Elijah lifted the rifle slightly. "You regret it first." Sawyer mounted his horse, snarled, and turned away. The rest followed, slow and humiliated. The snow began falling again, soft and thin. The townsfolk said nothing more. One by one they turned and rode back the way they came. When the last hoofprint faded from sight, Elijah let out a long breath. Mei Lin stepped off the porch and stood beside him. He looked down at her, but she was already watching the ridge. They didn't speak. Not that day. But something permanent had shifted. Not survival, not ownership, but choice. And together, they walked back toward the ranch. The snow melted slower that spring, clinging to the edges of the pasture and the base of the hills like it couldn't quite bear to leave. The ground softened too late, and the creek swelled with the weight of it, flowing faster than Elijah had seen in years. The ranch breathed again, like a long-held breath finally released. And yet, even as the grass began to push green through the thaw and birds returned in bright bursts of song, there was a stillness to the land. Not empty, but full, holding what had passed like a memory pressed between pages. Elijah moved slower now. He told himself it was the chill still clinging to his knees, but truth lay deeper. The days had changed him. The confrontation with Sawyer and the people of Auburn Ridge riding in behind him, it had carved something new into the place where silence once lived. Trust, not in the town, not in men, but in something older, in the earth, in time, in Mei Lin. She had taken to the morning chores with a kind of rhythm that made the air feel lighter. He watched her from the porch some mornings, the steam of her breath trailing as she gathered eggs, her scarf now faded and patched at the corners. She hummed sometimes when she thought he couldn't hear, songs from a world he didn't know, their melody as fluid and fragile as river reeds in wind. He'd come to depend on that sound. It marked the start of each day like a prayer. The ranch had changed, so had he, and yet some things remained. One afternoon, weeks after Sawyer disappeared from their lives like a bad storm that passed too quickly, Elijah took Mei Lin into town with him for the first time. It had been her suggestion. "We need thread," she said simply, "and needles, the kind with eyes not rusted shut." He hesitated, gaze flicking toward the road. "You sure?" She nodded. So they went. The ride was quiet, as always, but not empty. She rode beside him, not behind. Her braid had loosened in the wind by the time the church steeple came into view, and he saw her tuck it behind her ear without thinking. When they reached the main road, people watched again. But not like before. Mrs. Keller from the bakery waved a little from her step. Old Hawkins gave a polite nod. Less nervous now, more curious. Even the boy sweeping outside the saloon slowed to stare, not in fear, but in wonder. Mei Lin walked beside Elijah into the general store, her steps measured and steady. She didn't flinch when Hawkins asked if she needed help. She didn't look away when two young men muttered near the window. She stood at the counter, asked for what she wanted, and paid for it with a quiet grace that made Elijah feel proud in a way he hadn't known he could be again. When they left the store, the judge was outside, leaning on his cane, looking older than Elijah remembered. He tipped his hat. "Miss Mei Lin!" She inclined her head. "Judge Hollister, you settling all right out there?" She smiled, just barely. "Yes." He nodded, as if he'd been waiting to hear it. As they rode back toward the ranch, the sun high and bright against the thawing land, Elijah found himself watching her more than the trail. Her posture, her ease in the saddle, the way she scanned the horizon like she had always been meant to live under the sky. It caught something in him, deep and sharp. "You ever think about going back?" he asked suddenly. Mei Lin blinked. "To where?" "Home." She was quiet for a moment, then shook her head. "It's gone." He didn't push further. "Here is home now," she added, voice soft. The silence that followed felt fuller than speech. The weeks passed with a slow grace. The house was mended, the roof patched. A new coop was built near the edge of the field. Elijah taught her how to plow with the old ox he'd nearly given up on, and she taught him how to cook a rice porridge using grains she'd traded for in town. It tasted like warmth, like memory. He built her a garden plot. She filled it with rows so neat they looked drawn by ruler, planting seeds as if each one were a secret waiting to bloom. They worked side by side most days, sometimes without speaking for hours. But the silence had shifted. It was no longer distance. It was shared space. A mutual understanding. Two survivors not just surviving anymore. And yet, as the world softened into green, Elijah began to feel something he hadn't felt in so long he didn't recognize it at first. Fear. Not of men. Not of storms or sickness, but of change. It came one morning when he found her standing at the edge of the field, watching the sky. She stood so still, as if listening to something he couldn't hear. When he asked what she saw, she said, "Birds from the north. They come now. Like me, not born here, but staying." He nodded, but it sat in him like a stone. That night, after supper, she brought out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were letters. "Found them," she said. "In the attic." They were old, faded ink. His wife's handwriting. Elijah didn't touch them. "I thought maybe," Mei Lin said, "you should decide what to do." He looked at the bundle, then at her. The fire behind her made a halo of her shadow. "I already did," he said. She folded the cloth back over the letters, but didn't put them away. Later, long after the lamps had gone out, Elijah sat alone in the front room. He picked up the bundle, unwrapped the first page. His wife's words greeted him like ghosts in a language he had once known well. She had written about hope, about the boy, about the ranch, about him. By dawn he had read them all, and he wept. Not for the pain, but for the fact he'd forgotten how it felt to feel it. When Mei Lin rose that morning, she found him at the table, eyes hollow but open, the bundle of letters folded neatly before him. He looked at her and said, "Thank you," and then he smiled. Just a little. They planted the last of the garden together that afternoon. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived. Not from Sawyer, not from any Marshall. From a missionary woman in San Francisco, written in careful script, addressed to Mei Lin. "I've been looking for you," it read. The others made it across. "Safe. We didn't know what happened to you. If you are alive, if you are well, please write." Mei Lin read it once, twice, then folded it, set it on the table, and stared at the hills beyond the window. Elijah didn't ask. That night she stood outside long after the stars came out. When he joined her, she didn't turn. "You think I should go?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "I think," he said finally, "you should choose." She nodded, the breeze lifting the loose ends of her hair. I already did. In the days that followed, she wrote back. And stayed. The world had tried to sell her, silence her, break her. But on a stretch of land no one thought worth anything, with a man who'd long ago stopped believing in redemption, she had built a home. Not a prison, not a cage, a place to begin again. And she wasn't done building. The summer came in slowly that year, as if it too had learned caution from the season that came before. The days warmed gently, the winds softened, and the earth uncurled beneath the sun's forgiving touch. Grass pushed higher across the pasture, green and alive, while bees traced lazy loops between the wildflowers that sprang up near the creek's edge. The ranch breathed with steady lungs, not rushed, not burdened, just present, just alive. Elijah had not felt this kind of quiet in decades, not the kind born of absence or grief, but the kind that came when things were held gently together. When he walked the fields now, he didn't do it alone. Mei Lin trailed beside him or sometimes ahead of him, steps light and certain. The mare had taken to her completely, no longer twitching beneath her hands, responding with a calm Elijah had never coaxed from the animal himself. She had repainted the barn doors in early June. Not bright, just a deep earthen red that warmed under sunlight. He didn't ask why she did it. She just came in one morning with the smell of turpentine on her hands and said, "Color makes a place want to stay." He didn't argue. Inside the house, things had changed too. Curtains hung in the windows now, not just fabric, but ones she'd embroidered with shapes, branches, birds, stars. The corner by the fireplace had been cleared and filled with a low table she made herself. On it sat a small shrine. Nothing ostentatious, just a wooden figure, a bowl of dried fruit, a single white candle. He had asked her once what it was for. Memory, she said, not mourning. Just remembering. It became a place he would pass, without speaking. Sometimes, though, he left things there. One smooth stone, a pine cone, once the silver button from his son's old coat. She never commented on them, just moved them gently to one side, dusted the table, lit the candle, and let them be. People from town came out more often now. Mrs. Keller brought seeds and a sack of flour. The preacher's wife came once with a Bible and a timid smile, and left with a jar of pickled vegetables and a new scarf. One boy, no more than 12, rode out one morning with a broken stirrup and left with a lesson on how to mend leather and a slice of pear pie. Word had changed. So had they. One evening, Elijah sat on the porch sharpening the blade of his old wood-carving knife while Mei Lin knelt nearby, planting another row of herbs in a new cedar box. The air was thick with the scent of fresh soil and thyme. She looked up suddenly, squinting into the west. A rider was coming. He stood slowly, the knife loose in his palm. Mei Lin wiped her hands on her apron and rose, not with alarm, but readiness. They didn't flinch anymore, not like before. They watched. The horse crested the hill slowly, not rushing, just steady. When it came close enough to see the face of the man riding, Elijah relaxed a little. It wasn't Sawyer. It was a stranger. He was young, early 30s maybe, with skin tanned deep from sun and arms marked with the black smudges of inkwork. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a satchel across his chest. When he dismounted, he approached the porch with the quiet humility of someone who knew how to read the air. "Afternoon," the man said. "I'm looking for a Mei Lin." She stepped forward, chin slightly lifted. "I'm Mei Lin." He reached slowly into his bag, produced a rolled paper bound with twine. "From San Francisco. Sister Margaret asked me to deliver it myself. Said it wasn't something to trust the post with." She took the letter and nodded. "Thank you. I'll be riding back through in a few days. If there's a reply." "There will be." The man tipped his hat, turned, and rode off without another word. Elijah waited until the dust settled before speaking. "You expecting that?" "No," she said, "but I hoped." They sat together as the sky burned pink above them. She opened the letter carefully, unfolding it like something fragile. Her eyes scanned the page once, then again. Her hands trembled, just slightly, and then she folded it shut. 3 women I knew, 1 child. They're safe now. A church near the bay is helping them. They're teaching, sewing, healing. He nodded, letting her choose the rest. They asked if I want to come. He didn't move. She looked up. I told them I would think. He reached across the small space between their chairs and rested his hand gently on the back of hers. That's fair. She smiled, but it was tinged with sorrow. Later that night, he found her in the barn, brushing the mare slowly, as if the act itself steadied her. You don't owe me anything, he said quietly. I know, but this place, he paused, it owes you. She didn't answer, just kept brushing, long and slow. In the days that followed, something shifted in her. Not distance, not coldness, just a kind of restless focus. She moved through chores with sharper edges, fixed the fence posts by herself, reorganized the pantry, and stitched new quilts for the guest beds as if preparing something or someone. One morning, Elijah found her in the garden with a notebook open on her knees, sketching. The drawings weren't of herbs or animals. They were of rooms, spaces, layouts. You thinking of building? He asked. She looked up, surprised, then nodded. For them, she said. The women. He crouched beside her, fingers grazing the page. Here? She nodded again. He straightened slowly. We'll need more timber. I already spoke to the mill. They'll deliver on Monday. He blinked. You. I wrote to them. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, All right. We'll start with the foundation. And they did. Together. The first walls went up by the time the grass had turned golden again. They framed them by hand, with nails hammered through aching palms and beams lifted shoulder to shoulder. Townsfolk came to help. Not many, but enough. A woman named Clara from the edge of town brought books and shelving. A boy, Elijah, had once scolded for stealing peaches, brought a bushel of his own harvest, said it was payment. By fall, the house was standing, small but strong, whitewashed, with windows that faced the rising sun. She called it the second sunrise. When the first woman arrived, she came with nothing but a satchel and a bruised cheek. Mei Lin led her inside without a word. Made her tea. Let her sleep. The second came days later, then a mother and child, then another. They didn't stay forever. Some left after weeks. Some stayed a season. Some longer. But they came, and they healed. And always, they remembered who it was that had bought his way into their stories with 5 silent dollars and never once asked for anything back. As winter returned and the frost laced the windows once more, Elijah stood by the stove with a mug of hot cider. Mei Lin came in with snow in her hair and boots heavy with ice. You all right? He asked. She nodded. Just tired. You should rest. I will. She didn't, though. Not right away. She moved to the cupboard, pulled out 2 bowls, and began to ladle out stew. He watched her, the curve of her shoulder, the steady press of her breath. Then he spoke. I want to change the deed. She stopped. He set his mug down. Make it yours. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter. You already did. Not on paper. She turned to him. Her face wasn't surprised. It was solemn. Sure. You won't be here forever, she said. He met her eyes. That's why. He signed it the next morning. The notary rode out from town, dusted off his spectacles, and watched as Elijah Turner of Dust Creek Ranch made it all official. By the time he left, Mei Lin held the deed in her hands. Elijah didn't speak. He just walked out to the porch and watched the snow fall. That night, he sat beneath the stars, blanket pulled tight, breath fogging in front of him. Mei Lin came to stand beside him. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "No," he said. Then, after a pause, "Not anymore." They sat in silence again, not for lack of words, but because the words had already been lived. When he passed, it was in the spring. Peaceful. Quiet. Under the same sky he'd watched turn from grief to hope, from emptiness to meaning. She buried him beside his wife and child, near the edge of the field. She carved the stone herself. Elijah Turner. He gave freedom, and asked for nothing. And beside it, years later, they would add hers. Mei Lin. She gave the world. A second sunrise. From a lonely ranch haunted by silence to a home reborn in love, choice, and dignity, Elijah and Mei Lin's story reminds us that healing often begins with the smallest act of kindness, and that true freedom is not something given, but something built together. In a world that once tried to silence them, they found a voice in each other and turned pain into purpose, sorrow into sanctuary, and strangers into family. If this story moved you, don't write off just yet. Subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles and saddle up for more powerful tales of resilience, redemption, and romance set against the rugged beauty of the frontier. There's more love, grit, and untamed spirit waiting on the trail ahead. Don't miss it.